When a narcissist begins to unravel, you won't always see it in dramatic collapse at first. You won't hear the shouts or witness the full emotional explosion. Not yet. It starts slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. And the very first cracks almost always appear in the form of paranoia and defensiveness. They begin to see threats where none exist. They start reading malice into silence, hostility into disagreement, and betrayal into even the mildest form of correction. What used to be an ordinary conversation suddenly feels like walking through a minefield. You say something innocent, they twist it. You offer gentle feedback, they explode. You stay silent, they accuse you of plotting against them. Why? Because the world they've built, a world carefully constructed to protect their ego, is starting to crack. And when the illusion wobbles, their fear rushes in. See, at their core, narcissists are not truly confident. They are not deeply secure. They don't quietly believe in their worth the way healthy people do. Instead, they survive by building a fragile, inflated version of themselves, a false self. One that's untouchable, superior, always right, always in control. But that self is a lie, and lies require maintenance. It takes enormous mental and emotional energy to keep up the illusion, to keep everyone believing that they're stronger than they really are, smarter than they really are, more powerful than they truly feel inside. And the moment someone or something begins to challenge that illusion, they panic. That panic becomes paranoia. They begin to believe you're against them, that you're trying to tear them down, that the people closest to them are part of some conspiracy. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because their reality is built on a foundation that cannot be questioned. Questioning them feels like an attack. Disagreeing with them feels like betrayal. Silence feels like proof you're turning against them. So what do? They get defensive, quickly, aggressively, desperately. They lash out to regain control. They spin the narrative so they become the victim. They rewrite history to suit their emotional need. And you, if you're not careful, you get pulled into it. You find yourself defending words you never said, apologizing for emotions you didn't cause, tiptoeing around their moods just to keep the peace. But what you're really doing is feeding their illusion. And the closer they get to their breaking point, the worse this becomes. At this stage, it's no longer about logic. It's no longer about facts. It's about emotional survival. Their ego is fighting for its life. And when ego feels threatened, it does not reflect, it defends. That's why they can't hear you. That's why reason fails. That's why conversations loop endlessly without resolution. Their goal is not understanding, it's control. And in that pursuit, they will monitor your words, watch your tone, read into your silences, and prepare to attack before you even speak. Because when their ego feels unsafe, you become a threat, even if you love them, even if you've done nothing wrong. That's the tragedy. Paranoia begins to isolate them. And the more isolated they feel, the more defensive they become. It's a cycle, a spiral, and it marks the beginning of the fall. To understand why a narcissist begins to unravel, you have to understand what they're actually protecting. Because beneath the paranoia, beneath the defensiveness, beneath the aggression, there's something much more fragile. A false self. This isn't just about ego. It's not just about pride. It's about identity. Narcissists don't see themselves the way most people do. They don't believe they're flawed. They can't tolerate the idea that they might be wrong, ordinary, or vulnerable. So instead, they create a persona, a mask, a version of themselves that is perfect, invincible, superior. This false self becomes their shield, their protection from the unbearable truth they've spent their whole lives avoiding, that deep down they are insecure, afraid, ashamed. And that shame is not something they confront. It's something they bury. They hide it behind accomplishments, behind control, behind charm and manipulation. Every part of their life becomes part of the act. The people they surround themselves with, the way they speak, the image they craft, the power they demand, all of it is carefully designed to support the illusion. Because the illusion feels like survival. To expose the false self would mean facing the real self, the one they've worked so hard to silence, and that is terrifying. So they avoid exposure at all costs. They deflect blame. They rewrite stories. They gaslight. They lie. Not just to you, but to themselves. They convince themselves that they are always right, that others are jealous, that critics are enemies, that consequences are persecution. They build an entire reality where they are always the center, always the hero, or always the victim, but never, ever the problem. But here's the danger. The false self requires constant maintenance. It's exhausting. It's fragile. It depends entirely on others continuing to believe the performance. The moment someone questions the script, the mask begins to slip, and the fear of being exposed sets in. Because exposure means losing control. It means others might see the fear they've buried, the emptiness they carry, the humanity they refuse to acknowledge. It means losing the power they've built their identity on, and so they fight hard. Not for truth, but for the preservation of the illusion. Every argument, every manipulation, every attack is not just about winning. It's about hiding, protecting the mask at all costs. Because if the mask falls, so does the world they've built. And for a narcissist, that isn't just embarrassing, it's annihilation. They have no stable core to fall back on, no rooted identity in love, humility, or grace. All they have is the image, so they cling to it, defend it, worship it, and they fear more than anything that one day someone will see past it, that someone will see them as they really are. And when that day comes, the collapse begins. For a narcissist, control is not optional. It's not a luxury. It's not a preference. It's a necessity. It is the air they breathe, the structure that holds their world together, the one thing they believe they cannot live without. Because control is how they survive. You see, the narcissist's identity is not rooted in truth. It's not grounded in love, in humility, or in inner security. It's built on perception, on illusion, on the ability to shape the narrative, manipulate the emotions of others, and dominate every environment they enter. So when that control begins to slip, even slightly, they don't respond with humility. They don't ask questions. They don't reflect. They panic. And in that panic, they double down on dominance. Every look, every word, every decision becomes a strategy to reestablish control. They begin to monitor people more closely. They question loyalties. They scan every interaction for signs of threat or betrayal. They don't seek connection. They seek leverage. Because to them, relationships are not sacred. They're systems of control. People are not people. They are tools, pawns, pieces on a board they believe they're meant to command. That's why they interrupt, why they dominate conversations, why they withhold affection only to offer it later as reward. That's why they gaslight, not just to confuse, but to control what you believe about them and about yourself. They create chaos, then present themselves as the only calm center. They create fear, then offer themselves as the solution. And the more you respond, the more power they gain. But here's the irony. The more they try to control, the more people pull away. The more they tighten their grip, the more relationships begin to slip through their fingers. And with every loss, their desperation grows. They raise their voice. They raise the stakes. They raise the pressure on everyone around them to fall back in line, not because they're strong, but because they're terrified. Terrified of being irrelevant, of being out of control, of being seen as they truly are. Because if they're not controlling the story, someone else might tell the truth. And the truth to a narcissist is dangerous because truth cannot be controlled. And control is the only thing that makes them feel safe. So they cling to it at all costs. Even if it means destroying the very people who once cared for them. Even if it means standing alone in a world they tried so hard to dominate. Because for them, control isn't about power anymore. It's about survival. When a narcissist feels exposed, cornered, or out of control, they don't choose reason. They don't pause to reflect. They don't seek reconciliation. Instead, they react. Fast, forcefully, predictably. And while the behaviors may vary, they almost always follow the same script: manipulation, aggression, or withdrawal. These are not random reactions. They are survival mechanisms, reflexes deeply wired into the way a narcissist protects their false self. Let's begin with manipulation. This is their most common, most subtle, and often most effective weapon. They twist stories. They reframe conversations. They rewrite history, not to find truth, but to regain control. They may guilt trip you for setting boundaries. They may play the victim to shift blame. They may shower you with sudden affection, kindness, or vulnerability to make you second-guess your decision to walk away. It's not sincerity, it's strategy. Because to a narcissist, emotional response equals access. If they can make you feel sympathy, guilt, fear, confusion, they can keep you close. And if you're close, they're still in control. But if manipulation fails, they escalate. That's when aggression surfaces. It may come through harsh words, personal attacks, explosive outbursts designed to intimidate and overwhelm. You'll see them raise their voice, slam the door, threaten to expose you, shame you, or punish you emotionally. Their goal is not clarity, it's submission. They want you to retreat, to apologize, to doubt yourself so they can reassert dominance. And when even aggression doesn't work, when the people around them refuse to engage, refuse to fear them, refuse to be moved, they retreat. Withdrawal is the third response. It looks quiet, but don't be fooled. It's still a power play. They disappear not to reflect, but to punish. They give the silent treatment. They vanish without warning. They withhold affection, connection, even presence until you break. It's a test. Will you chase them? Will you beg? Will you feel responsible for the disconnection? And if you do, they win. Because once again, your reaction has given them control. Each of these responses serves the same purpose: to avoid exposure, to avoid responsibility, and to restore the illusion that they are in control. But here's what matters. Once you recognize the pattern, you can refuse to play the game. You can see manipulation for what it is. You can stand your ground in the face of aggression. You can find peace even in their silence. Because the moment you stop reacting, you stop feeding their system. And without your response, they have nothing left to work with. No fuel, no leverage, no power, just themselves. And the truth they've been running from all along. When a narcissist starts to collapse, they don't go down quietly. They don't retreat in solitude. They don't process their unraveling on their own. No, they drag others into it. And if you're not careful, you could be pulled so deep into their spiral that you forget where your emotions end and theirs begin. It often starts small, subtle, a shift in energy, a strange conversation, a feeling that something's off. Then suddenly, you're in the middle of chaos you didn't create, but feel responsible for fixing. That's how it works, because narcissists don't suffer silently. They project their pain. They offload their fear. They distribute their emotional weight to those closest to them. And they do it through manipulation, through emotional pressure, through creating confusion. They demand loyalty, but never give it. They expect understanding, but offer none in return. They want compassion, but weaponize yours against you. The closer they get to their breaking point, the more they expect you to carry the burden of holding them together. And how do they do that? They force you to take sides. They frame every situation as a battle of loyalty. If you disagree with them, you've betrayed them. If you stay neutral, you're part of the enemy. They back you into a corner, emotionally, relationally, spiritually, until your only choices feel like submission or separation. And even then, they make separation feel like a moral failure on your part. They will say you abandoned them. They will accuse you of being heartless. They will remind you of everything they ever did for you, not because they're grateful, but because they need leverage. And if guilt doesn't work, they'll switch tactics. Suddenly, they're the victim. Tears, silence, regret. Words that sound like repentance but are really just bait to draw you back in. You begin to feel like the only person who can save them. But here's the truth, you can't. And it's not your job to try, because this collapse wasn't caused by you. It was caused by the unsustainable weight of the world they built. A world of illusions, manipulations, unmet expectations. You didn't build it. You don't owe them your peace to keep it standing. If you engage, if you try to reason, defend, explain, you only sink deeper, because to a narcissist, your reaction is their oxygen. It keeps them going. It validates their version of the story. It gives them something to control. So what should you do? You step back. You stay grounded. You protect your boundary like your sanity depends on it. Because it does. You don't respond to chaos with explanation. You don't meet manipulation with justification. You don't let their spiral become your identity. Because if you do, you'll lose yourself trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved. They want control, not healing. And when you finally stop engaging, you take away the very thing they're fighting to hold on to: power. One of the most revealing moments in the life of a narcissist is not when they're calm, collected, or charming. It's when the mask slips. And when that moment comes, you'll see it not in quiet retreat, but in uncontrolled emotional outbursts. For years, perhaps even decades, they've worked hard to project an image of superiority, composure, dominance. They've learned how to manipulate perception, how to control the narrative, how to keep themselves looking untouchable in the eyes of others. But underneath that image, underneath that carefully constructed facade, is pressure, raw, mounting pressure. Because living behind a mask is exhausting. And as cracks begin to form, as control begins to slip, as people stop playing along with the performance, the pressure breaks through. At first, it may be subtle. Irritation over something small, an odd tone, a passive-aggressive jab. But soon, the storm arrives. You'll witness rage that feels disproportionate to the situation, accusations that seem pulled from thin air, tears that appear suddenly, followed by shouting, followed by silence, followed by blame. It's chaos, but not random. It's chaos with a purpose, to confuse, to control, to pull you back in, because the narcissist is no longer reacting to you. They're reacting to the collapse of the world they built. They feel cornered, exposed, powerless, and instead of facing that truth, they erupt. One moment, they're furious. The next, they're wounded. One moment, they're intimidating. The next, they're pleading. It's not about justice. It's not about fairness. It's not about real emotion. It's about regaining control by any means necessary. They will say things they don't mean, or perhaps things they've always meant, but were too careful to say before. They will cross boundaries you thought were sacred. They will reach for guilt, for fear, for confusion, whatever tool keeps you from stepping away. But here's what you need to remember. These outbursts are not expressions of authenticity. They are symptoms of collapse. They are the sounds of a system breaking down. Because when the mask slips and the illusion fails and the image begins to shatter, the narcissist is left with the one thing they've spent their entire life running from: themselves. Not powerful, not in control, not admired, just afraid. And in that moment, you must not mistake intensity for sincerity. You must not confuse volatility with vulnerability. What you are witnessing is not healing, it's fear. And fear in the hands of a narcissist is always weaponized. So don't react. Don't defend. Don't try to reason your way through their storm. Stand still. Stand clear. And remember, when the mask slips, truth finally walks in. Behind every outburst, every explosion of rage, every erratic swing of emotion, there is a deeper conflict most never see. A war, raging silently within the narcissist, because their reactions are not just about what's happening around them, they're about what's collapsing inside of them. See, narcissists live with one relentless fear: exposure. Not exposure of facts, but exposure of self. The fear that someone might see past the performance, past the charm, past the superiority. That someone might glimpse the truth they've buried, the insecurity, the shame, the hollow sense of worth they've masked their entire lives. When people stop feeding the illusion, when admiration fades, when control slips through their hands, that fear surges, and that fear becomes chaos. What you see as irrational anger is, in fact, panic. What you interpret as manipulation is their desperate attempt to outrun their own reflection. Their world is built on perception. The image must be preserved at all costs. But when cracks form, they lose the ability to manage how others see them, and worse, how they see themselves. The person in the mirror no longer matches the role they've rehearsed. They're not admired, not praised, not in charge. And that shatters them, so they fight. not just with you, but with the mirror. They rage to silence the inner voice that says, this isn't who you really are. They accuse to push blame outward so they don't have to look inward. They twist reality because reality has become unbearable. What looks like dominance is actually desperation. What sounds like control is actually fear trying not to drown. 1 minute they're yelling because rage feels like strength. The next minute they're weeping because victimhood still earns attention. It's not coherent. It's not stable. Because the self holding it all together was never real to begin with. And that's the war. Not with you, not with the world, but with themselves. A life spent pretending is finally running out of performance, and what remains is everything they tried to avoid. That's why it feels so unpredictable, so intense, so volatile, because the enemy is inside, and they don't know how to fight it, but you do. By not entering their war, by refusing to be their battleground, by letting them face what only they can confront, and by remembering their chaos is not your responsibility. At first you might think the instability is genuine. The tears, the trembling voice, the sudden rage, the sorrow, the silence. It all looks real. It feels raw. It seems like they're finally being honest. But with a narcissist, emotional chaos is not always vulnerability. More often, it's strategy. Because once they realize they're losing control externally, they shift tactics internally. They weaponize their emotions to regain ground. It's subtle at first. They start acting out, reacting disproportionately, crying without warning, accusing without cause. Then, when you begin to pull away, they collapse, they plead, they say they're sorry, they promise they'll change. They tell you how much they need you, how lost they'd be if you left. And just like that, you're caught again. Not in logic, not in guilt, but in emotion. Because emotion, when manipulated well, bypasses reason. You begin to second guess yourself. Maybe you were too harsh. Maybe you misread the situation. Maybe this really is a turning point. But it's not. Because instability for the narcissist is not a cry for help. It's a tool. It's meant to destabilize you, to make you feel responsible for their pain, to confuse your boundaries, to muddy the truth you were so close to standing on. And the moment you soften, the moment you comfort them, the moment you step back into their orbit, they win. Because now, you've shifted roles. You are no longer the one setting boundaries. You are now the caretaker, the rescuer, the one trying to calm the storm they created. And the cycle begins again, because that's the goal, to keep the cycle going, to keep you emotionally engaged so they remain in control. They don't want resolution, they want reaction. And when you stop reacting, they escalate. They test new tactics, more dramatic collapses, more intense outbursts, more unpredictable swings between love and fury, victimhood and rage, until they find what works on you. Because every person responds to something, and narcissists are masterful at learning which emotion pulls your heart the hardest. But once you see it, once you name it for what it is, you can step out of the trap. You can choose clarity over confusion, truth over sympathy, stillness over reaction. And when you do, you disarm their most powerful weapon, your emotional response. Because without your reaction, their instability becomes just noise. And in silence, they lose control. The tears, the rage, the pleading, the trembling voice that says, "I'm sorry," or "don't leave." It all feels real. It looks intense. It sounds like a breakthrough. But with a narcissist, you must look past the performance to see the truth. Because their emotions, as loud, raw, and chaotic as they appear, are rarely rooted in repentance. They're rooted in fear. The rage you see is not about justice. It's not about being misunderstood. It's not even about the argument at hand. It's about exposure. It's about the terrifying realization that someone has gotten close enough to see through them, close enough to see the cracks in the image, the inconsistency in the words, the truth behind the charm. And so they erupt, not to protect the relationship, but to protect the illusion. And the tears, they are not the softening of a hardened heart. They are not signs of transformation. They are not invitations to reconciliation. They are tools meant to reset the narrative, to flip the roles, to make you question what you were certain of just moments before. Because if they can cry and collapse and convince you they're broken, maybe you'll come closer. Maybe you'll stay. Maybe you'll doubt what you were starting to see. But here's the truth. What you are witnessing in their rage and their sorrow is not strength breaking down. It is fear rising to the surface. The fear of being seen, the fear of losing control, the fear of no longer being able to manipulate the world around them. They have spent years, decades in some cases, perfecting the mask, curating the image, controlling the environment, and now all of it is slipping. That's what you're feeling in the room. Not love, not guilt, not healing, friction between the person they pretend to be and the truth they can no longer contain. Their tears are not about you. Their anger is not because of you. You've simply gotten too close to what they fear most. And that fear is not something they can control. So they try to control you by crying, by shouting, by apologizing just enough to reset the game. But this isn't a breakthrough. It's a tactic. And once you see it, once you stop personalizing it, you take away its power. Because in the end, their deepest fear was never losing you. It was losing the version of themselves you used to believe in. And when that illusion dies, so does their ability to keep you trapped. When a narcissist feels their control slipping, they don't let go quietly. They don't accept it with grace. They don't take a step back to reflect or reassess. They panic. And that panic looks like desperation. But this isn't ordinary desperation. It's not the kind that comes from heartbreak or simple fear of loss. It's the kind that feels like survival. Because for a narcissist, control isn't just something they want. It's what their entire identity depends on. Without it, they have nothing. So when that control begins to collapse, they launch into crisis mode, a full-scale response, all tactics on the table. Some go on the attack, sharp words, cruel accusations, threats designed to corner you and force submission. Others play the victim. They rewrite the story, cast themselves as the one who's been wronged, paint you as cruel, selfish, cold. And some take a softer route, charm, false humility, tears laced with carefully chosen phrases. I've changed. I see it now. I'll do whatever it takes. But it's not about change. It's not about growth. It's about control. They are drowning. And instead of learning to swim, they're grabbing for anything, anyone, to keep them from going under. If that means lying, they'll lie. If that means manipulating, they'll manipulate. If that means weaponizing your compassion, your history, your hope for reconciliation, they will do that too. Because to a narcissist, regaining control is more important than honesty, integrity, or even love. They'll say what they need to say, do what they need to do, pretend to be whoever you need them to be, for as long as it takes to get you back under their influence. But here's what you must see. This isn't transformation, it's survival. They are not acting from a place of conviction. They are acting from fear. Fear of being irrelevant, fear of losing the ability to shape the narrative, fear of facing a world where they are no longer the one in charge. So when you begin to stand firm, when you begin to step away, they escalate. Not because they care about the relationship, but because they need the power back. And this is the moment of decision, because this is where most people get pulled back in, not because they're weak, but because the narcissist's desperation feels so real, so loud, so convincing. But real change doesn't beg, doesn't threaten, doesn't perform. It endures in silence. It proves itself over time. And desperation always demands immediate response. So when you see it, don't confuse it with sincerity. Don't mistake it for love. Because what you're seeing is not a turning point. It's a final attempt to stay in control. When a narcissist senses that fear and aggression aren't working, they switch masks. They move from control to redemption. From anger to humility, from threat to apology. But don't be fooled. This is not transformation. This is strategy. It's not the fruit of self-awareness. It's not the result of inner conviction. It's the next step in maintaining control. They've realized that rage has limits, that pushing too hard can push people away. So now they pull. They soften their tone. They lower their voice. They offer confessions, just enough to sound real, just enough to keep you hopeful. They say things like, "I finally see it now. I've changed. I know I hurt you, but I was hurting too. You're the only one who ever really cared." And you, being the person you are, you want to believe it. You want to think maybe this time it's different. Maybe they've finally reached the point where truth can begin, but this is not truth. This is performance. And how do you know? Because the moment you stay, the moment you soften, the moment you say, "Okay, let's try again," the mask shifts. Subtly, but inevitably. Soon the humility fades. The language changes. The old patterns return, maybe not all at once, but piece by piece. Why? Because the change was never real. It was a role, a last-ditch effort to stop you from walking away, and once they have you back, they no longer need to pretend. This kind of redemption is not rooted in brokenness. It's rooted in manipulation. It's designed to disarm you, to reset the dynamic, to make you question what you were starting to see clearly. It says, "Stay." But it really means, "Stay under my control." So what do you do when the words sound right, but your spirit feels a warning? You pay attention. You observe patterns. You watch what they do after the apology, because true repentance requires more than remorse. It requires responsibility. It shows up in changed behavior, in accountability, in silence that doesn't demand praise. But the narcissist's version of redemption is loud, immediate, and always conditional. They want forgiveness without process, trust without time, restoration without repair. And if you don't offer that, you become the problem again. So understand this. The performance of change is not change, it's a tactic. And once you see it, you are no longer bound by it, because real healing doesn't need an audience, and real redemption doesn't ask to be believed. It proves itself by who you become when no one's watching. If manipulation is the strategy, then your compassion is the leverage. Because once rage doesn't work and control begins to slip, a narcissist turns to your empathy. They know exactly how to access your heart. They've studied it. They've tested it. They've seen how far you'll go to be kind, to be loyal, to not give up on someone in pain. So they play that chord. They remind you of the good moments. They bring up memories, shared struggles, past promises. They say, after all we've been through. Or, I thought you were different. Or even, you're the only one who never gave up on me. And suddenly you feel it. That pull, that ache, that voice in your head whispering, what if they really are changing? What if walking away now makes you the one who failed? But pause, step back, and ask yourself, why do they need your guilt to keep you near? Because that's what this is. Not a conversation, not reconciliation, but emotional exploitation. They use your kindness as currency. They weaponize your conscience. They turn your mercy into a chain. And the more you feel responsible for them, the more power they regain over you. You stop setting boundaries. You excuse their behavior. You start managing their emotions instead of living your truth. And all the while, they're watching, testing, adjusting, seeing how much discomfort you'll tolerate before you pull away, seeing how far you'll bend before you break. But here's what they never expected, that you would see it. That one day you'd realize they weren't reaching out for healing, they were reaching out for control, and the only thing standing between you and your freedom is the part of you that still wants to rescue them. But you cannot rescue someone who is using their brokenness as a means of control. You cannot save someone who's using your compassion to avoid saving themselves. So what do? You draw the line, not in anger, but in clarity. You remind yourself your kindness is not weakness, your empathy is not consent, and your boundaries are not cruelty. It's okay to care about someone and still walk away. It's okay to feel the ache and still protect your peace. It's okay to be compassionate without being controlled. Because true love never manipulates. True healing doesn't demand sacrifice from others to survive, and your compassion, when guarded by truth, becomes wisdom. Not a weapon they can use, but a strength they can no longer exploit. There comes a point in the narcissist's unraveling when the room grows quiet. Not because the conflict is over, not because the wounds are healed, but because the people are gone. And that silence, the one they spent years avoiding, finally surrounds them. But here's the truth. They created it. This isolation is not something that happened to them. It's something they chose. One decision, one manipulation, one broken relationship at a time. You see, narcissists are masterful at building walls. Walls that separate, not protect. Walls made of control, deceit, intimidation. Walls designed to keep others close, but never truly connected. And for a while, it works. People stay, out of guilt, out of fear, out of hope. But eventually, even the most loyal begin to see through the cracks. They realize that no matter how much they give, it will never be enough. That every gesture of kindness is used as leverage. That every moment of honesty is twisted into accusation, and slowly they begin to leave, one by one. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. And the narcissist is left in the very place they feared the most, alone. But instead of seeing this as the consequence of their own actions, they rewrite the story. They abandoned me. They were never loyal. I cut off toxic people. But deep down, they know. They know it was the lies, the manipulation, the impossible demands, the inability to truly love without conditions, and now, with no one left to mirror back the illusion, they are forced to face what they've been avoiding all along, themselves. No praise, no admiration, no audience, just silence and truth. It's a terrifying moment. Not because they lost people, but because they realized they were never truly connected to them in the first place. They collected people like tools, used them like props, relied on them for validation, but never built real relationship. And now they are left with the emptiness they worked so hard to hide. But here's what matters most. You didn't cause this. You didn't abandon them. You didn't break them. You didn't create the silence they now sit in. They did. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment they chose power over connection, it led here. So don't carry the guilt for their isolation. It's not yours to fix. Some will learn from the silence. Some will harden against it. But either way, you are not the reason for it. You are simply the one who finally chose to walk out of the storm they never intended to end. There comes a moment, quiet at first, but undeniable, when the illusion shatters. The persona they've spent years constructing cracks. The charm no longer convinces. The confidence starts to feel forced. The stories stop lining up. The mask begins to slip. And what was once seen as strength now looks like control. What once passed as charisma now feels like manipulation. What once earned admiration now triggers suspicion. People begin to notice. They notice the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the emotional volatility. They remember the times they were blamed for everything but praised for nothing. They replay conversations that didn't feel quite right. They begin to connect the dots, and suddenly the image collapses, not with an explosion, but with quiet clarity. This is not who they claim to be, and the narcissist knows it. They feel it. They see it in your eyes, in your silence, in your refusal to play along, and that terrifies them. Because their entire identity was never built on who they truly are, but on who they could convince others to believe they were. They studied people, learned the right words, mimicked the right emotions, projected an image tailored to every situation. They wore masks, not to deceive you maliciously, but to survive, to stay above reproach, to stay in control. But the performance can only go so far. And when the audience stops applauding, when the roles stop working, when people stop responding, they lose their grip. They lash out. They spiral. They make mistakes. Big ones. Ones they can't explain. Ones they can't cover. Ones that make others see the truth more clearly than ever before. And once the illusion breaks, it doesn't come back. Not in the same way. Because people don't unsee what's been revealed. They don't unhear what's been said in anger. They don't forget the fear behind the fury. And the narcissist, now exposed, stand face to face with what they've always run from, themselves. No mask, no performance, no protection. Just the raw, unfiltered reality of who they've become. And for someone who built their life on perception, that is more terrifying than any consequence. Because once the illusion is gone, they are no longer in control of the story. And when they're no longer in control, they no longer feel safe. The power they thought they had was never in who they were. It was in what others believed. And when belief dies, so does their kingdom. When all else fails, when the charm wears off, when the manipulation no longer lands and the silence no longer pulls, the narcissist reaches their final stage, the breakdown. Not a private one, Not a quiet one, but a full emotional collapse that spills out in every direction. This isn't a moment of healing. It's not repentance. It's not awakening. It's desperation laid bare because the control they depended on has finally slipped through their fingers. And there's nothing left to hold. So they spiral, fast, loud, unfiltered. 1 minute, they're yelling. The next, they're crying, then blaming, then pleading, then shutting down entirely. The cycle spins so fast, you can't tell which version is real. And that's the point. Because at this stage, the narcissist isn't trying to win you back. They're trying not to disappear. They don't know who they are without control, without attention, without someone to react. And now, no one's reacting. The tactics no longer work. The mask is gone. The people are leaving. The mirror is clear. And they're terrified. So the breakdown begins. They might accuse everyone at once, then claim everyone abandoned them. They'll say they were mistreated, then threaten retaliation. They'll post publicly. They'll isolate privately. They'll say, "No one ever loved me," while rejecting every hand that ever reached out. It's chaos, but not random. It's the implosion of a system that was never built to last. Because the truth is, control is exhausting, pretending is unsustainable, and image management can only take you so far. Eventually, the performance ends, and when it does, the collapse is not just emotional, it's existential. They are no longer the admired one, no longer the victim, no longer the center of everyone's world. They are simply unmasked, alone, exposed, and that is unbearable. So they try everything. Rapid fire, one tactic after another. They'll say what they think you need to hear. They'll do what they think might earn a response. They'll push every emotional button you've ever shown them. But it's not about connection. It's about control. One last time. And if that doesn't work, they collapse further. Into bitterness, into self-pity, into withdrawal disguised as rejection. This is why I don't trust anyone. This is why I keep people at a distance. This is why I'm better off alone. But they're not better off. They're just out of moves. Because once control is gone, there's nothing left to keep the illusion alive. And without the illusion, they're forced to confront the one thing they've spent their entire life avoiding: reality. In the end, the collapse of the narcissist doesn't happen because you fought back louder or proved your point more forcefully. It doesn't come because you expose them publicly or match their manipulation with your own strategy. Their collapse comes from one thing: your clarity. Because nothing is more threatening to a narcissist than someone who finally sees clearly. Someone who no longer second guesses. Someone who no longer flinches. Someone who no longer feels the need to explain, defend, or rescue. When you are no longer confused, they are no longer in control. That is the moment everything unravels. Your clarity removes their leverage. Your silence disarms their chaos. Your calm reveals their instability, and your decision to walk away, not in rage, but in resolve, shatters the illusion they worked so hard to maintain. Because they cannot perform for an audience that no longer applauds. They cannot manipulate a mind that no longer needs their approval. They cannot dominate a heart that no longer feels guilty for choosing peace. This is what they never expected. They expected tears. They expected begging. They expected you to come back again and again and again. But this time, you don't. This time, you don't engage, you don't justify, you don't respond to the bait. You've seen the cycle, you've named it, you've broken it, and in doing so, you've taken back what they feared you'd one day realize was always yours, your power, your clarity, your freedom, because in the end, they were never as strong as they pretended to be. They just depended on your confusion to keep you from noticing. But now you've noticed. Now you've seen. Now you've chosen. And that is the beginning of their end.